Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to our attendees in the UK and Europe, and welcome to today's webinar, the 2021 State of IT Operations Management in the UK, how IT leaders can drive faster recovery in a post-pandemic world. This webinar is based on a survey commissioned by OpsRamp and carried out by a third-party research partner. We surveyed 102 IT operations decision makers at the IT director level or above in the United Kingdom. Enterprises surveyed have more than 500 employees and at least £3.5 million in annual technology budgets. At a high level, the survey looks at the specific factors constraining organizational innovation and how technology leaders are responding to that. The study shares how strategies such as tool modernization and legacy portfolio rationalization, along with investments such as AIOps and digital operations management platforms, can unlock value and drive differentiation in a competitive market. Now, before we get started, I wanted to let you know that we will leave time for questions and answers at the end of our discussion. To submit questions during our panel discussion today, please use the Q&A function on Zoom at any time during the presentation. We will address your questions during the Q&A session at the end. So let's meet our panelists. We have a couple of former CTOs on our webinar today. Our special guest panelist is Mark Burgess, founder and principal of GTechE. Mark is a technologist, scientist, advisor to public and private organizations, author, and was the founder and original architect of CF Engine, the open source configuration management system. Mark, welcome to our webinar, and perhaps you could fill in all your fans in the UK and Europe on what you're up to these days at GTechE.
Thanks, Dennis. Hello, everybody. Yeah, so I've been working in a little bit in the area of security and telecoms lately, especially around 5G and so-called 6G in the future. And I must apologize to everyone in advance. I have a bit of a cold today, so I may cough a bit unintentionally, but I hope I'll get through this.
Okay, great to have you here, Mark. Mark will be joined today by OpsRamp's Eric Cook. Eric has spent most of the last 2 decades in the ITOps space and is currently OpsRamp's director of EMEA Solutions Consulting based in London. Eric, tell us what a solutions consulting director does exactly.
Well, it's basically a fancy way of saying I'm in charge of our pre-sales and post-sales delivery teams here in Europe. So I've been with OpsRamp for about 4 years, but as you said, I've spent the last 2 decades in IT operations management. So hopefully I'll be able to add something to the conversation today. And I hope you feel better soon, Mark.
All right, great. Thanks, Eric. And thanks for taking time out of your day to join us today. So let's get right into this. Our first insight there, how AI and machine learning are changing IT operations as we know it. And how do we know IT operations today? Well, 2 words, tool sprawl. Nearly half of IT teams we surveyed had between 6 and 10 ITOps tools, with more than a third using between 11 and 20. Another 11% have more than 20. So a lot of tool sprawl out there. Mark, I'll start with you. You're our special guest. What factors are driving IT operations tool sprawl? I mean, I'm pretty sure this isn't anything new in the industry. What do you see? You advise clients on this kind of thing. What do you see out there?
Right. I mean, sprawl is kind of the natural way of things, right? It's almost the second law of thermodynamics. You know, things will tend to fall apart. It's hard to tidy up. Things get messy up on their own, but it costs a bit of effort to tidy up. So it will naturally spread out. But I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. What matters is isn't how many tools you have or how much mess you have necessarily, whether or not it works for you. Is it helping you or harming you? So we can't really say if it's good or bad. I think it's how it happens is sort of interesting though. And it often comes about from the difficulties of improving, you know, the process of continuous improvement, whether it's an ITIL thing or an agile thing. Once you've started to use something, it's really hard to get rid of tools because the new tools that are coming in don't usually completely replace the old ones. There are gaps in the functionality, so you can never fully reconcile the way you did it before with the way you want to do it now. And then there are all kinds of sort of generational reasons. A new generation of employees will tend to favor newer, shiny things that they've read about on the net. And at some point, you try to get rid of old things and just take the risk. but it is, that's the point, right? It's risk management. And if you're conservative by nature, you'll try not to get rid of things which may introduce new risk. So trying new stuff is good, but you tend to keep these old contraptions around for longer than perhaps they should stay around. The other aspect, I think, is just the sheer number of options available today. There are so many open source projects. It used to be a farmer's market of choice, but now we have this sort of super mega variety warehouse store of competing offers in the marketplace. But I think what's exciting about this space of knowledge-based management is the new sort of interoperable platforms that are coming and showing us a door to that future.
So it sounds like tool sprawl is going to be with us for a while. Eric, you spend a lot of time with OpsRamp customers and prospects in the UK and elsewhere in EMEA. What do you see driving IT operations tool sprawl at these organizations?
Well, I first of all, I agree completely with what Mark said. From the perspective of IT operations teams and CIOs that I talk to on a daily basis, they're constantly at war with internal teams that are all trying to do different things and ultimately achieve the same goal. They want to modernize, but they don't want to lose what they have. So they end up putting more tools on top of the existing tools. And sometimes that's a good thing. And sometimes it's a bad thing, because what they lose sight of is they lose sight of how that all should come together to support business processes. While they may have really good observability in one area or another area, they may be looking really intently at a specific thing and not able to see the real problems that it's causing to the business. The other thing I see is that when you have all this tool sprawl, you also are collecting so much more data than you actually need. Because if you think about the old legacy tools, and I'm talking about the big four, the BMC, the IBM, the CA, the Micro Focus, they are built on 20 some years of metric collection. And so people have typically been collecting every metric they can find, whether or not it's useful. And I think when you do that, you actually cause yourself more problems, because you may have a lot of data, but what are you actually using it for? If the data you're collecting isn't usable, you shouldn't be collecting it in the first place. So what we do is a lot of what I do is I work with organizations trying to help them rethink and reorganize about what they really need. Do you need to collect those 5,000 metrics about that database platform, or do you really just need the information about whether it works and how well it works and whether or not it's giving you the business need you want? As people do these shifts around, just like they did when we went from nothing to ITIL and from the mad scramble of waterfall to agile, these were huge shifts in process, and now IT operations is really going through the same thing.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Delivering compelling digital experiences with the right tools. This takes a look at ITOM tool investments for 2021 that we asked about in our survey. And you can see there's not a whole lot of separation there from top to bottom. The US, we did this in the US too, it was almost very similar, just a little bit of a change at the top there. And here in the UK, it was hybrid infrastructure monitoring, 51%, AIOps, 48%. So why do you think those, I know it's not a whole lot of differentiation there, Mark, but why do you think those two, hybrid infrastructure monitoring and AIOps, top the list of ITOM tool investments?
That was for me?
Sorry, Mark, yeah. That was
sure.
Asking you.
I think monitoring is always going to be at the top of any list because of what Eric just said. The desire to know is strong, and the desire to control things is even stronger. And so people tend to be attracted towards any kind of solution that will give them observability or monitoring strengths inside their portfolio of systems and their infrastructure. And there's also sort of another generation of tools that are very good at recreating visually appealing interfaces that draw people in. And that helps to bring a quality of work experience as well. So again, a lot of the generational shift to younger employees, they tend to like these cool interfaces. And so it brings some enjoyment to the job of engineers, which, of course, is important too, because people need to feel good about the work they do. And thank goodness for that. No one wants an army of mindless slaves working for them. So, AI is the current attention in the media. So it's natural that AIOps is going to be coming up in the news, and people are going to be interested in this because they see that this increasing amount of data is becoming a thing that humans alone cannot sustain. We can't consume this data, as Eric was saying. So we're going to need to have sensors in not only in local infrastructure, but in the cloud infrastructure. So these hybrid spaces are going to create even more pressure for us to correlate and sort of merge data streams. And then there's the challenge, of the smart workspaces, the smart homes, smart office spaces, the smart factories, the whole 5G story again, if you like, that's coming in. All of this is going to bring only more data into the picture. So the ability to know that data and understand it in some fashion is super important. I think, again, going back to this point before about risk management, having hybrid capabilities is good risk management, because as we go through these large scale changes in infrastructure, we've first been pushed from on-premises and co-located facilities to the cloud because of its flexibility, ease of adoption, change of capital to operational costs, and so on. But then you see trends going the other way, right? So according to Andreas and Horowitz's report a few weeks back, repatriation to private facilities is now on the increase because the price of cloud is going up, right? It's not as cheap as it was promised to be because it's popular. And that's the economics of it. So if that's going to be a real trend, then companies need to be able to shift their infrastructure back and forth between possibly different clouds and from co-located facilities, on-premises facilities. And this creates a great deal of complexity. So having that ability the insight into your infrastructure in the face of all that moving around and relocation of services is super important. Localization is good for cost saving, but cloud is good for on-demand scaling. So, again, this move into the future with the edge computing, I think, is also important because as this develops, not just in these sort of devices that we talk to in our homes and start talking by themselves in our homes, but to the point where we actually have computing, what's the word, idle computing facilities, which can be used by the cloud providers at the edge. This is going to be something that allows us to move or rent the space closer to us. So there's going to be a whole new dimension to this. And this, of course, is also part of the 5G, 6G dream, to be able to integrate the infrastructures of telcos with the cloud providers and so on and so on. All of this, I think, is driving the need for a superior cognitive experience in understanding what the heck is going on in our data centers and infrastructure, because it's not going to be it's not going to get any easier to understand the incredible complexity of what we're building.
Okay. Eric, what do you think? Hybrid infrastructure, AIOps. I mean, those, any surprise those two ended up at the top of this this tight race here?
Muted. There you go. Not really. No, I'm not surprised at all. And frankly, the third one, cloud native observability, really belongs up there with hybrid infrastructure monitoring, because it's, even though it's classed as something different, ultimately it's all part of the same bucket. And it's interesting, Mark, that you describe hybrid adoption this way, because we see this day in and day out when we're talking to operations management professionals and DevOps people, that they want to put what they want to they want to put their data or their applications or their services in the right place at the right time, and they want to be able to move them around, and they don't want to worry about whether it's at this location or if it's in this cloud. All they really care about is the data secure in a way that puts me in compliance with government regulations, and can I save as much money moving it where it needs to be? So we absolutely see that. But there's also a huge opportunity, I think, because there's so much flexibility now, because you can have things anywhere you want them. The problem with that is people will put things everywhere that they can. And so what we really see is the need to have platforms actually bring that all together into one place, because otherwise you end up with even more tool sprawl. I look at a number of companies today that are looking at different types of observability, whether that's from the cloud native side or from the cloud side or even from their on-prem monitoring tools, but they don't bring it together, even though what they're doing is they're adding a lot more data, as you've said, to the problem. They're not actually addressing it, and it's becoming harder to see what matters. What they're doing is they're just adding tools to the bucket to solve momentary problems. And you made that point that it has to be beautiful and people have to be able to see it and observe it, and that adds to people's engagement with it. And that is absolutely true. But I find that the problem with the sprawl and that issue being together is that you end up having all of these dashboards. For a long time, and I think after the tool sprawl, because there was a big tool sprawl explosion in the mid to late 90s as well. And after that came out, we came up with this idea of a single pane of glass, right? And what we've done is we've gone away from that model again, and now we're coming back to it with the advent of platforms. Ultimately, our customers are asking questions like, how do I solve the problem using AIOps? So the hybrid infrastructure monitoring, the cloud observability, the digital experience monitoring, that's great. But if I'm feeding all that data, where is it going? How am I feeding it somewhere that's going to make sense of it and actually help me make better decisions? And as infrastructure is everywhere, this question is becoming critical.
You made the point actually, Eric, right back at the beginning, that it's not just about collecting data, but it's about understanding what it means. And what I've seen certainly over the many, many years is that monitoring tools tend to collect the same kind of metrics over and over. Again, you see, as you say, going back to the big four, people will always collect CPU percentage utilization and memory consumption and so on. So that gives you a quantitative view, but that quantitative thing may be misleading in some ways unless you know what it means. It doesn't necessarily reflect the meaning of what's happening. So the ability to have that qualitative view, or this so-called semantics of the operations, that's where AI is really strong in being able to detect patterns.
I totally agree, and I'll actually add just one last thought to that. You mentioned CPU utilization, which is always a big bugaboo because everybody says, "Oh, well, it's an important thing. I need to collect it." Well, if there's a problem, you may need to look at it, sure. But I find that most CIOs would be much more concerned with CPU underutilization, because if you're underutilizing the resources, you're causing yourself financial strain instead of potential application issues.
Yes.
Yeah, so let's dig a little bit deeper into that AIOps question. What are your plans for AIOps deployment this year? 55% have plans to deploy it this year. 42% think they already have deployed it. We asked this question in the US survey as well, and those numbers are almost reversed. Maybe people just think they have AIOps when they really don't. Only 3% with no plans there. So anyway, you look at it, you get a lot of AIOps deployment in the UK this year, if firms haven't already deployed it. Eric, what are you seeing out there? I mean, you've been in the US before as well. What is causing the surge of adoption in the UK, especially?
Well, let me start off by saying that part of the reason for this question, and I would assume the reason that a lot of people said yes to this, and probably more in the US, is because AIOps means a lot of things to a lot of people. Because there are several parts of AIOps, right? There's the ability to look at data and join it together and make better outputs and decisions. But then there's also the automation side of it. How do we automate the processes that come out of all that data collection? So I think that that's probably why it looks very high, is because people may have adopted certain parts of AIOps without actually deploying AIOps as an entire strategy, right? Because AIOps could be something like Ansible or Jenkins, right? So, but it can also be a lot more than that. But I think today everybody's talking about observability, but that's ultimately just a buzzword, right? It's it's a buzzword for collecting data and displaying it. It's something they're already doing, and everybody's doing, whether they're doing it and they call it MI, or whether they're doing it and they call it monitoring. We've just got this new buzzword, and so while people now have observability at top of mind, they're trying to figure out what they have to do with all that data. They want to figure out how to make that data useful, how to make it work for them, and how to take automatic actions from it. The problem is multiplied by the fact that most enterprises are lacking critical skill sets in certain areas, especially on cloud native technologies and public cloud technologies. So while they know maybe how to collect that data, they don't know what to do with it. And AIOps can help solve that problem by making it more of a concise collection, by cleaning up the noise and actually giving them a plan of action. Observability in itself is great, but AIOps is the other side of the coin, right? Observability is our collection of data, our ability to present that data back and make sense of it. But for me, AIOps really is about, what do we do with that data when we collect it? How do we put it to work? And how do we truly embrace process automation? Because I think people have dipped their toe in process automation over the last few years. Some people do a good job of process automation on the provisioning side, but usually not on the remediation side, or even on the scaling side. And so we've been told in IT for many years, we've got to do more with less. But I believe that adopting AIOps can actually get us there. And then the last thing that I'll address is you mentioned that these numbers were kind of reversed in the US. And I think that you'll see a little more caution in Europe, right, with the adoption of new technologies and new processes. The Europeans overall tend to be a little more skeptical about those sorts of things. But I say one of the things that I love about Europe is that when they embrace something, for example, ITIL is a great example of that. DevOps, SRE are great examples. When they embrace it, they fully embrace it, where the US may take longer to roll it out. That overall, I think the Europeans, once they adopt it, it'll be adopted and it'll become the world standard. So I'm very excited to see where that's going.
Mark, any thoughts on this? So the AIOps deployment in the UK, the trends there, buzzwords?
Well, yeah, everything Eric just said. It's data, isn't it? It's yeah, it's. I think scale is a key driver. You know, obviously with AI, it's in the news. It's everyone's talking about it. People will always fly towards the flame. But the scale of infrastructure is another thing that, like I mentioned before, that will tend to put pressure on people in a sort of cognitive way. It's just too much information. And we need to be able to process it and make sense of it, especially with the infrastructure part. As we say, it's being spread around all over the place, lots of different vendors, etc. But there's also the globalization of services and infrastructure as well. There might be different time zones to take care of. How do you, if you're getting a signal from one time zone, how does it compare to another time zone? How do you make sense of those things? So many things relating to data. And some of the larger organizations have had to deal with this for a long time, so they're more practiced in this. But again, there's a whole new generation of companies coming up who have less resources, smaller companies, and they don't have that experience, so it's new to them. And having this kind of smart and scalable way of interpreting data to shed light on these signals is going to be kind of important. The platform question, I think, is also key. As Eric says, all services are kind of based on processes, and processes involve some kind of a data pipeline. You take this and you feed it into the next thing, and then that's fed into another thing, which grinds it up and puts it in a package. And that complexity requires a lot of tool interoperability. And that's a great thing that platforms provide for you, some wiring for free, if you will, to make things work. And again, as we get into this 5G, 6G future of infrastructure, which we're being promised, however slowly it may be arriving, this is only going to become increasingly complex. So every movement in that direction also means that the services that we are providing becoming more mission critical, because each location is playing a larger role in a more global system of intercooperation. So AIOps combines these aspects, these three aspects of data collection, learning of these patterns that we alluded to before, and formulating responses, these algorithmic responses, if you like, or deployments or patching, remediations, call them what you will. And this is very close to my heart because, you know, this is how I got into the industry years back with CF Engine around the turn of the millennium, pre-cloud actually, but very much in this area of having agents which are learning in situ, collecting data based on a policy, which is kind of your platform today, and being able to select options based on the current circumstances. And it's that adaptability to circumstances which has been missing from many of the platforms in the past. They've been too rigid, too brittle. The ability to adapt to changes in scale, to changes in location, to shifting amounts of different infrastructure in different circumstances. This is going to be super important. And then to understand that whole picture again, because humans have limited cognitive abilities, very difficult. And if you just sort of create this old-fashioned view of network operations center and throw everything on a gigantic NASA-like dashboard, there will be so many screens to look at, people won't be able to even, you know, take in the information.
Right.
So there has to be a way to sort of pre-process it, correlate it, curate it, and make it presentable to humans for decision making. So that analysis is super important. You know, for a while, there's been this big data push in the industry, getting people just to sort of invest in collecting, you know, buy hard disks. Hard disks are cheap, storage tech, and so on. But the promise of what to do with the data always fell short of expectations, you know. Again, just too much information. And okay, you can try to churn it through a gigantic cloud, but it may just cost you a lot of money, generate a lot of heat to melt the ice caps, and actually not give any kind of outcome. So you want some kind of system working for you, like your, you know, your MI6, looking at the data feeds, picking out those important activities and figuring out when something needs to be done, when you need to shift your policy from one kind of policy to another kind of policy. And I think this is where AIOps has its sweet spot. We're heading towards this place where every volume of space around us is doing something. It contains a new digital service, whether it's to our phones, our computers, these smart devices, and so on. And we're going to have augmented reality intruding before long. We've seen many, many smart cities projects across China and Middle East. Actually, Europe and America are far behind in smart cities, but maybe we're doing smart tooling first. But so these are the things that are pressuring us towards being prepared for this kind of thing that's coming along. And of course, we should always be prepared. We don't want to be buying tools after we're in a difficult situation. So it's great to be investing in these capabilities up front. And I think there's a huge potential here. So, you know, it may be a long way to go before a majority of executives can connect the dots to defend investing in a big platform change. But these challenges are coming faster than we think. So I do believe that it's a positive signal that people are looking to make these investments already now.
Yeah, so a lot of data out there to make sense of. So we're going to have to pick up the pace here. Look at that second insight, the mandate for IT operations modernization. What is stopping IT organizations from innovating today? So we got two major things came up here. 49% each for the pace of technological innovation, which we certainly saw pick up in the last year with the pandemic. And 49% also say legacy tools are holding people back. So things are moving faster. You're still stuck on a lot of legacy tools. How can IT operations leaders better support their teams when they're faced with that reality? Eric, what do you advise?
Well, I think that, as you see digital transformation accelerating, which is really what happened during the pandemic, right? The teams have to evolve and they have to adapt to new business processes because the business is actually forcing this on the technology teams and they have to adapt. So people sometimes forget that the evolution of IT is actually directly linked to the needs of businesses. And so as those businesses are changing the way that they do things, for example, your banks are almost entirely remote now. In the UK, we had a record number of bank branches close over the last 2 years because everything is going online and that's driving that behavior. But the idea of distributed systems, though, is not new. Wholly distributed IT teams, that is a new concept, right? People are used to having concentrated groups of people in different places around the world in order to address technology issues. So they're now trying to solve these problems while not necessarily being able to collaborate in the same ways as they were. Not that they can't collaborate as effectively, but just not in the same ways. But now the business is saying, we want everything for all of our customers and all of our internal employees to be available anytime, anywhere, any device. It doesn't matter. So what is feeding that idea? The idea is things like DevOps and SRE coming to the forefront as well. But I think just because, and this what happens is in those cases, a lot of times IT or traditional operations and says, okay, well, DevOps has it, SRE team has it, so I'm going to be hands off with it. But the problem is there are still shared services. There are still use cases where there's an application developed by one team that works with an application developed by another team that works with a legacy system like an AS400 or something like that to ultimately deliver the business service that we want to. So there's this combination of technologies, and that's where the legacy tooling comes in too, because people still have those legacy tools, and they need to innovate if they're going to get to that next level. The last thing that I'll say is I think that IT leaders are trying to solve a bunch of different problems with tools that are just not fit for purpose anymore. We run into this all the time where they've got not even one of the big four. Maybe they've just got 15 different tools and they can't actually make sense of what's going on. It's like trying to manage a 100-acre farm with the tools they use in their back garden, right? It's just not going to work.
Okay, so Mark, any quick thoughts on this this conundrum here, where you have innovation moving fast, but still a lot of legacy tools holding you back?
Eric just reminded me mentioning AS400. Some years ago, it was probably almost 20 now, but still, I was buying tickets for a concert here in Oslo, and we had to go to the company that was doing this, and this is the post office official ticket buying system. It's all online. Looked super fancy on the website. When we got there, we found that this whole website for the whole of Norway is being run on one 386 PC as a front end with 2 serial lines going back to an old PDP-11, which was the actual software they were running. So there's a legacy example of business case legacy for you. So actually, in the title of this webinar, you mentioned COVID and the pandemic and how this is sort of an indication of things that have changed us. And it's not often that we have an event like a pandemic to shape a change in an organization in the way that we've seen perhaps in the last year with people working offline and so on. Usually innovation takes place on a much slower scale, and it's conservative because there's always this issue of risk that we mentioned earlier. People are conservative by nature. They stick to the tools they understand, and they're afraid of things that they possibly don't understand. They don't want to disrupt necessarily. So that will always tend to hold people back. I don't think it's the tools that are holding us back as much as IT culture itself. Humans get used to doing things in a certain way. So often if you want to make a change in tooling, you need to make a change in people. That's easier to do in the US, where people change jobs much more often. In Europe, we're much more conservative, stay in jobs for longer, and generally slower, less risk-taking, I think, than in other countries. In other areas, Europe tends to be slow in that way. So, so that's one aspect. But few companies are resourceful enough to power through their own change with a little bit of market forces and so on. But innovation, it's really hard. It's like Machiavelli said, because the innovator has for enemies everyone who did well under the old scheme, but only the lukewarm support of people who may do well under the new. So people, again, for risk reasons, will be hesitant to simply upgrade or change based on a bunch of marketing. But I think there are two good reasons to invest in tooling. One, of course, is to solve a problem, a known problem, a business solution. But the other is to help to retrain staff, because it's, again, the change in tooling can be a lead to changing or retraining people, like getting them to think in a new way. And I often think that this is one of the sort of hidden virtues of platforms, is that they are actually sort of teaching systems. You log in, it shows you, presents the world to you in a certain fashion, with a certain model, and you begin to interact with it in a certain way. You pick up new habits. And so, when you invest in a tool like that, you're actually investing in the future of the way that you do things. So what IT leaders can do is to, support teams, is not just simply necessarily give them what they ask for, because there may be many reasons to pick tools, including my favorite influencer has told me I need this new tool, or whatever it is. But to enter into a dialogue with staff about what kind of needs they have, and then figure out together what kind of platform would best benefit the business and the kinds of processes that they need to make changes to, so that people can feel that they're being looked after, they're part of the solution rather than being imposed upon with a hammer to solve the problem. And then you sort of create this envelope for change, which is a protected environment rather than sort of cutting edge, which feels a bit dangerous. It's a bit more under control. So I like that idea that the way leaders and engineers or teams in general interact with each other is in this kind of dialogue where they figure out what kind of platform needs do they have for their job. And this is the way to accelerate progress in the long run, by being a little bit cautious in the beginning, building more exponentially on what's gained as you go along, if that makes sense. I think my cold is interfering a little bit with my brain here.
Okay, let's get on to the next question here. Emergence of digital operations management platforms. So we're going to look at these two slides back to back. 56% of UK IT leaders plan to invest in digital operations management platforms this year. Pretty much everyone surveyed actually sees the value of these platforms, whether they will have the budget for them or not. But why do they want to take a platform approach? So if we go to our final survey data slide here, more than anything, it's about bringing the power of automation and AIOps to bear. Mark, I know you had some thoughts about this, so if you can jump right back in and answer this question. I mean, what advice would you give to IT operations teams who are looking to take this platform approach to operations?
So your market folks may hate me or try to assassinate me or something for saying this, but I don't think this is about cost savings. No one sort of ends up spending less when they invest in platforms. So, you don't buy a platform to save money. So that's not it. Costs get moved around and so on. But again, these platforms are incredibly important because they give you several things. They give you this out-of-the-box data circuitry, connecting together all these interoperable bits and pieces that are quite hard to connect, by yourself. You don't go to the supermarket and buy a bunch of components and start building things if you can simply buy something more off the shelf. And these platforms are somewhat off the shelf. So this ease of putting pieces together, this interoperability or data circuitry, will save a huge amount of time in the future. Of course, we always had these platforms. In the past, even things like Excel would run whole company. I still know major corporations that basically run on Excel data sheets, email to one another. But then we also had things like CMDB, and now we've got cloud, AWS, and so on. But these large systems that you revolve your operations around, these platforms, excuse me, they are learning centers as much as operations centers. And they do help to focus business operations the way we think about problems, which of course will enhance the customer experience if we have a more consistent take on implementing, delivering services. And of course, they're very flexible. Ironically, a platform sounds like a bit of a vendor lock-in trap, but platforms, especially when they're based on interoperability, can be exciting places where people grow into them, right? Because they contain opportunities where you can learn a little bit more about this thing, or go a bit deeper on that thing. So, technical people love platforms too, because they form a kind of an environment, a work environment. And that may sound dramatic, but people actually love these kind of unifying, I wouldn't say ideologies, but these unifying features of work that help them to focus and do a good job. But the challenge of the platform is building a meaningful relationship to the user, right? So there are good platforms and bad platforms. A bad platform would simply throw a bunch of data at you, as we've discussed. A good platform will lead the user in, draw the user in to a point where they want to come back to it because they find real value in it. And there's a subtle balance between, ease of use, fancy user interface, and actually being able to draw users in because you have exactly the right answers at the right places. So this is why platforms, I think, are super important, and perhaps underestimated, because they develop relationships, and relationships are really the driving force for business, of course.
Eric, any final thoughts on the platform approach before we move to a Q&A?
Eric, you're on mute.
Yep, I saw him on mute again. Sorry about that. Sorry. So yeah, I think first of all, I'm just going to disagree with Mark on the first sentence the first statement that he made, which is about it isn't about cost savings. It can be, but it's maybe not just as black and white as that. It depends on the adaptation. So for example, when we talk to enterprises, it is definitely about cost shifting, not about cost savings, and it's about acceleration. But when we talk to MSPs, which is another market segment that we address quite well, for service providers, it definitely is about cost savings and lowering the cost of actually delivering services to their customers. And because they manage so many different things, machine learning and AIOps are key functions for them so that they can actually adapt to the changing environments of their customers faster and ultimately not have as many chargebacks and things like that. And now I'll go back to agreeing with you, because I think on the platform issue, it's definitely something that is attracting a lot of people because of interoperability and being able to solve very complex technical problems in a single place without having to have all of the knowledge about those individual problems. And I think that's a huge driver. And I will just at the end say that, when we're talking about hybrid cloud, this is the true challenge, is how do we actually get all that visibility and make sense of it, whether it's on-prem, it's in the cloud, it's in SaaS, it's in this silo or that silo, because while technology works that way, the business doesn't. The business only considers the services they want to provide to either their internal or external customers, and all they care about are are those services working at the time they need to work and delivering the outcome we want? Everything else is on IT to solve. And so IT needs new tools, and platforms are one of those ideal things they can use.
Okay, thanks, Eric. So we have just a few minutes left here for Q&A. And I have one question here in the queue. Do you see tool investments by IT operations teams being driven by the rapid adoption of public cloud and cloud native infrastructure? Once again, just use the Q&A tool, the widget there on Zoom if you have any questions. So public cloud, cloud native infrastructure, how is that driving tool adoption? Who wants to take a stab at that?
You want to take that, Mark, or you want me to take it?
Well, we can both say a little bit. I think it's pretty obviously yes. There's certainly a whole bunch of course, new opportunity. A whole bunch of solutions will explode around that opportunity. I personally know a couple of startups who've become very large and successful companies as a result of making tools for exactly that purpose. So, yes, of course, any major innovation like that will lead to a whole raft of tool changes.
And I just connect that to my last statement, which is absolutely that's true. And that's mostly true because people don't have the skill sets necessary to know what they don't know.
Okay, and we have one more question here, and you guys kind of touched on that during the webinar, but I'll ask it again since it came up in the queue. Is there a fundamental difference in how the US and the UK look at AIOps? Is the UK more hesitant to adopt newer technologies? I think we kind of did address that, but Eric, why don't you reiterate that since you have some experience dealing with customers in both countries?
Yeah, I think Mark and I both actually mentioned that that European technology adoption tends to be more conservative, but once it is, it's much more. It becomes mainstream much quicker. And we've absolutely seen that difference between the US and EMEA, is that AIOps, the adoption is slower, but it's not significantly slower. Let me also say that, because the interest levels are just as high. The difference is there's more due diligence going in, I think, in Europe than in America, where people are more apt to just get the new thing and start using it.
I think, excuse me, guys. I think that's absolutely true, that just the buying process is actually a bit longer in Europe for a variety of reasons, regulatory reasons. In Europe, we love to regulate things.
Okay. Yes, I think we've answered that question by now. One last question here. I think we have a little bit of time left. I have tool sprawl and it's working for now. I struggle to justify changing tools and processes if it's working today. Can you provide some strong benefits or opportunities to consolidating my tool sets within one central platform? That could be a long question, but if we have 30 seconds, can we answer that question? Some quick hit ideas there.
I think
consolidate tools.
I think we kind of answered that in the talk. First of all, this is a risk question, right? It's a risk management question. If it's risky, you don't feel comfortable, don't do it. On the other hand, for every moment you don't do it, there's a new risk coming, which is that you don't do it. So you have to keep running to stand still in the IT industry. That's part of the problem. As time goes on, you'll find that tools simply won't cover the same things that the old generation of tools covered. So this is why we constantly need to reinvest in education, training, knowledge in the industry, because everything is changing all the time, and things that you previously understood well can no longer be understood in the same way because it's a moving target. So I think it's really important that we just keep moving, actually, a little bit by little bit. Don't go too fast that you fall, but be sure to do a little bit of innovation every year, a little bit of retraining, a little bit of change. And that's the way to keep up over time. Certainly don't have to go after every new shiny toy because there are way too many.
Okay, Eric, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say that I totally agree. I think that, a horse and cart and a car both get you the same outcome in the end. One gets you there much faster.
Okay, and with that, on that note, we're going to wrap things up today. Many thanks again to our panelists, Mark and Eric, and to everyone for joining us today. We're going to continue the conversation online. Please do follow us on social media. Check out our blog. That's blog.opsramp.com. Mark actually has a guest blog in there about the state of IT operations management today, and we're publishing that today, as a matter of fact. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and week.